In my previous video, I misspoke when I said that block chords should always be arpeggiated. However, I thought that instead of going back and correcting the video, I would take the opportunity to talk a little bit more about arpeggiations and why they're so important in harpsichord playing. I think in the previous video I also mentioned that the way one arpeggiates can emphasize and de-emphasize certain harmonic progressions, but also certain harmonic contents of a piece. So that, for example, if you have a more dissonant chord, one could decide to actually play it as a block chord, so that the crunch of the dissonance is emphasized rather than spreading it out by breaking the chord. In this video, I wanted to talk about a different aspect that concerns arpeggiating chords, and this has to do with creating dynamics on the harpsichord. Now, I know that you're probably aware of the myth that one cannot alter dynamics on the harpsichord. This is actually completely untrue. There are several ways of doing this, and I would say one way that you can try to alter dynamics on the harpsichord has to do with how fast or how slowly you pluck the strings. And this, of course, has to do with how fast or how slowly you depress a key on the harpsichord. It has nothing to do with how hard you hit it. That's the piano technique. However, if you practice pressing a key slowly or faster, you will notice that this actually alters the dynamic. This depends very much also on how responsive your instrument is. However, it is a way of varying dynamics on the harpsichord. Another way of varying dynamics has to do with broken chords and has to do with how you break the chords, how you arpeggiate them, because a very important element in achieving dynamic contrast on a harpsichord has to do with utilizing the natural resonance of the instrument. This is, of course, something very, very different from playing the piano, and this is why it is much more important how one arpeggiates and how one plays chords on a harpsichord. When I say arpeggiation, the first thing I would like to mention is that here I'm thinking of a wide spectrum. So you can think about arpeggiating or breaking up chords, block chords, either by playing the notes almost together, all the way to a much wider spreading out of the chords. So there are many, many variances in between. There is a great range there. Other ways of arpeggiating chords include, first of all, filling in a chord. What I mean by this is that you have the notes of the chord, but then you can decide to add passing notes in between. You will notice if you look at ornament tables of French Baroque composers that these kinds of filling in of chords are actually parts of the different ornaments that they used. So this is a very, very important technique. Another thing to consider is that while the default that we're all familiar with has to do with starting from the lowest note of the chord and spreading upwards, you can actually do the opposite. So you can start from the top note and go towards the lowest note. You can also start in the middle of the chord. So you can start with the middle notes and kind of arpeggiate outwards. This is another way of doing it. And yet another aspect that I would like to mention about chords has to do not so much with how you play the notes, but also how you release them. What I mean by this is that the tendency is when we arpeggiate a chord or where we play a chord, we may play all the notes together, we may play them at a different time, so we break up the chord. However, releasing the chord tends to happen at once, so we release all the keys at once. Actually, one way to exploit more the resonance of the harpsichord is not to do this. So just as one can gradually play the notes of a chord, one can also gradually release the notes of the chord. This can also create a very interesting dynamic effect, and an effect that, at least in my opinion, could be explored a lot more than at least what I hear on recordings. So these are a few thoughts that I wanted to offer about arpeggiations. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, this is not about not playing block chords. Of course, you can do that as well. It has to do with whether you want to emphasize something, for example, a dissonance, but there are all sorts of ways of creating an emphasis, and the way one plays a chord, the way one can break up the notes, the way one can release slowly each one of the notes, every one of these things plays a very important role in creating dynamic effects on the harpsichord and making the harpsichord the very wonderfully expressive instrument that it is. Thank you for watching.